Cybersecurity threats are persistent and constantly evolving. Nearly half of organizations in CSO's latest Global State of Information Security survey say they are reevaluating their security standards as a result of the recent spate of very public data breaches. With the massive expansion of users and devices continuously connecting to the internet, website security is a top concern for businesses whose online presence is critical. A vulnerable website puts a business's reputation, not to mention its revenue, at risk. Hello and welcome to this audio webcast titled DNS Security, Safeguarding Your Online Presence, brought to you by Neustar and IDG. My name is Rob O'Regan, Digital Content Strategist for IDG's Strategic Marketing Services, and I'll be your moderator today. Joining me is Reynold Harbin, Vice President of Product Management for Neustar, a leading provider of real-time, cloud-based information services and analytics. Reynold leads the product and market growth strategy for Neustar's security services. Hello, Reynold.
Hi, Rob.
Great to have you with us here today. So here's today's agenda. We'll talk about our recent Market Pulse survey that offers some interesting insights about DNS. Then Reynold will talk about the importance of DNS, potential threats, and the best way to defend against these threats. So Reynold, please share your thoughts on the recent IDG research and the highlights that you took away from it.
Okay, thanks again, Rob. Let me actually move over to a few of the key takeaways from the survey that we just completed. This is a summary of the key findings, but really I pull out really four of them that are, I think, very significant for the industry. The first is that among the professionals that we surveyed in IT, the largest concerns for them included DNS outages. About 74% of the respondents were extremely concerned about DNS outages and how that would affect their availability. The second takeaway is that really a top concern regarding DNS threats in particular is poor customer experience if their DNS is impacted by DDoS, for example, and also what the reputation of their online brand could be if they weren't able to keep their DNS up. It's interesting to see also that in the respondents, only about half of the respondents said that they were very confident or extremely confident with their current level of protection for DNS, which basically means there's at least half of the respondents do have concerns about keeping their DNS up. And when you get into the details as to why they're concerned about DNS, it really comes down to DDoS. About 60% of those respondents are concerned about attacks or distributed attacks on their DNS infrastructure.
Great. I want to come back to a couple of those stats a bit later. But first, Reynold, why has DNS become such a critical component, not just of IT infrastructure, but of a company's ability to create a positive customer experience?
It's actually been really growing in terms of the importance of DNS in just overall in the internet infrastructure. If you look at some of the stats behind the growing number of users and the Internet of Things in particular, really everything is becoming connected. And if you look at the user base, you see that there's over 3 billion users on the web today. That's expected to grow over the next 3 years to almost 4 billion. And all of those users are coming in from various devices, multiple devices. Oftentimes users have many, much more than one or two devices. You're talking about 4, 5, 6 devices. And there's even an estimate that there's going to be 25 billion connected devices in about 5 or 6 years, all connected to the internet. And these are users who are getting used to having all of their products kind of enhanced with connected services that exist on the internet, and your customers are all expecting that the services tied to their products or websites that they're trying to serve to are always going to be available immediately and secure. I have a few other slides that kind of explain a bit about really what DNS is and why it's important. Let me forward the slide here a little bit just to give some background on DNS. DNS is essentially a system that is almost the first step, or really is the first step for applications when they connect a user to a service on the internet. So people who browse the web, they always start with a domain, like Google.com, for example. But the underlying internet infrastructure is really addressed using IP addresses. And there's a whole distributed system designed to make sure that your browser can understand, where do I connect to when I type in this particular domain name. And it's not just for websites, it's for APIs that an app connects to when they're connecting to the internet. It's what mail servers use when they figure out where do I send particular email messages. Really, it's a huge registry of information translating a domain name to IP addresses for certain services needed to make the internet work. So if an organization fails to serve DNS to any of these browsers or apps, it's essentially the same as your website or your APIs being down and your user not being able to get the services that they're expecting to get. And now, most of the time, DNS works pretty well. It's really been around since the beginning, and most users are not really even aware of the fact that there's a very sophisticated system supporting, their browsing habits and behavior. So they just expect it to work, but when it doesn't work, their sites are essentially down. Now, what's also interesting when you look at the respondents that we surveyed, they were really concerned about availability of DNS. About 96% of the respondents said that the most important thing for them when they look at DNS service providers is service availability. But if you really dig into it even deeper, security becomes really important too. They all say that DNS security vulnerability is a high concern for these respondents as well. And in particular, they're worried about DNS being taken offline, and they want a way to safeguard their DNS from these growing number of DDoS attacks.
That's a great segue into security threats related to DNS. Reynold, please walk us through the threat landscape and some of the ways IT teams can defend against those threats.
Sure. So yeah, the threats to DNS, let me just summarize some of the things that we see by running a DNS service, but also the respondents that have participated in the survey, some of the threats that they're concerned about. Really, you can break down these threats into 4 different categories. If you think about the importance of DNS in almost every single web transaction, you can understand why attackers look to DNS as a good thing to attack. The first concern is just general DDoS attacks. So if a malicious attacker is looking to take your digital presence offline, DNS is a great place to start, because if I can take off the domain from essentially having an IP address to resolve to, then essentially I'm wiping off the digital presence from the web. So the very first concern is DDoS attacks, essentially overwhelming DNS infrastructure so that nobody can get a resolution as to where a particular website lives on the internet. Second concern is something called cache poisoning, where essentially an attacker can insert themselves in between an online business and end users and put an incorrect address directing users to essentially their own infrastructure and potentially stealing data. So that's essentially poisoning the DNS cache. A third area of threat is resolver vulnerabilities. And what that basically refers to is much of the DNS infrastructure on the internet today is based on open source software, where an attacker can look at the source code, understand how it works, identify vulnerabilities, and potentially exploit vulnerabilities because they can learn so much about the systems that are actually providing DNS resolution. And then a final threat is phishing and farming. And the reason that's relevant to DNS is oftentimes when you receive an email that is pretending to be a brand, but it actually isn't, they're actually spoofing a brand, oftentimes those kinds of phishing attacks can be avoided by doing some fairly straightforward things inside of your DNS so that your online brand is not associated with attacks or with fraud, if you will. I wanted to highlight one other item here, not only on the threats for DNS, but also the impact of the security issues. In this survey, we've also looked at what's the impact of poor DNS protection. And what we find is, when we talk to our customers about DDoS in particular, and we run a large service that protects customers against DDoS, we find that customers are oftentimes impacted to the tune of $1 million per day if a DDoS is successful for an entire day. You can really impact your end users, and oftentimes DNS is a target for DDoS. But in addition to taking you offline, we also hear that customers who do receive DDoS attacks also experienced data loss or loss of particular IP during a DDoS. Those are statistics from our annual DDoS report. So when looking at the impact of security problems, as I mentioned, $1 million per day, there are different ways that customers can essentially strengthen their DNS. And it's the fairly typical set of options. First is you can look at your hosting provider or your ISP to provide your DNS services for you. You can also build it yourself, and we'll get into each of these details, or you can use a managed services provider. So if you go through each of these, what you'll find is that hosting providers and ISPs, generally they're not experts running DNS. They run them because it's really part of their ISP service, but they don't know as much about running a service in a distributed fashion to get the best in availability and performance and security. The second option of doing it yourself, if you're willing to essentially spend the CapEx, bring in the expertise, and also deal with the scalability, which is an ongoing challenge for DNS, then there are some options for do-it-yourself, but you'll find generally it's much more expensive and more difficult to manage, as it has to be up 24/7. And then finally, a managed services provider. There are several managed service providers out there. In general, you get the best of not having to spend CapEx. You get the expertise of someone who just runs a DNS service. In general, you get additional security services and access to a much larger set of infrastructure and bandwidth.
Reynold, I did find it interesting that in our Market Pulse survey, just half of the respondents said they were very or extremely confident of their level of protection from DNS threats, and 42% said they were not even sure if their organization has had an outage or other issues related to DNS security vulnerabilities. Just curious, what does that tell you about the level of attention that security teams are putting on DNS?
Well, I think you see that, really ultimately what it shows is that there's a large number of enterprises that are really not protecting their online presence. Those who've suffered an attack or that are measuring and monitoring end-user performance understand the importance of really having a robust DNS infrastructure because it's oftentimes attacked. And if you've been attacked, then you really need a managed services provider, and you need a method for actually measuring the performance and availability of DNS. If you haven't had an attack, or if you don't have the visibility, I believe those are the same sets of users who are not really aware of any outages or issues related to DNS. But the reality is there's just a large number of enterprises that are still not being served and still not protecting their online presence as they should.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about Neustar's network and the service you offer for DNS security.
Sure, yeah. So we offer a DNS service that's really been in the market for many years, one of the pioneers really in managed DNS services called Ultra DNS. Secure service, managed DNS service for really all kinds of DNS, but primarily known for authoritative DNS. The first thing I'll point out is that we built it for availability and redundancy. And the reason that's important is because your end users are really all over the country and oftentimes all over the world, and you want to keep your DNS resolutions as close to the end user as possible so that you kind of avoid network issues if you can keep those resolutions local. So we basically have a network of nodes across 6 different continents, 30 locations, and each of those locations we've expanded out the underlying architecture so that we can do local mitigation. We've got local mitigation equipment in each of those nodes, which basically means if a DDoS occurs, we're able to mitigate and really filter out malicious traffic right at those DNS nodes. Then if you really look into the software that underlies the service, the first thing that I wanted to highlight is that we don't use an underlying open source set of software for our DNS resolver. So we've actually built it from the ground up, and it's closed in the sense that attackers are not able to inspect our source code and understand really how it works. Of course, it has standard DNS responses, but the underlying way it works is not open source. Second, it's been built from the ground up for DDoS protection, if you will. It's designed so that if we detect in any of those 30 nodes that we have malicious DNS traffic coming, we will redirect that malicious traffic to a separate network that only handles DDoS mitigation. Another thing that we do, and this is actually very important as you look at different managed DNS providers, is you're essentially sharing your infrastructure with several other businesses. It's the same as really any other cloud provider. So what you want to make sure is that when a DNS provider or a customer on a DNS provider is attacked with DDoS, that you're not collateral damage. So we built something called name server announcement segmentation, which really what that means is that we really have a very granular set of customers kind of divided up across the network. And what that means is that if there's an attack on one customer, it's not going to affect other customers. We also have support for DNSSEC, which basically means end users and client resolvers are able to authenticate that this resolution is coming from you. It's actually coming from a server that you've authorized, if you will. And we also have a highly trained 24/7 NOC to support the service. We're able to make sure that only valid end users are making changes to their own DNS through two-factor authentication. And we also have partnerships with companies that really help brands and enterprises really understand how their domains are being used. For example, to email out to different end users. Just make sure that only emails coming from your mail servers or your partner's mail servers are actually landing in the inboxes of your end users. And that's actually enabled through our DNS service. And then finally, if I could just kind of highlight a couple of things. What we find is when customers choose our Ultra DNS service, it's because they're putting a premium on availability and security and performance. We've got the best SLA in the industry, I believe. We've built out security into the service itself by not having open source software providing the resolutions, and also by building in DDoS mitigation appliances right into the nodes. It's a very high-performing network, and it's built to scale. We've got billions of DNS queries happening on the platform every day, and we're continuing to grow that out as we bring on new customers and as they grow organically.
Great. Thanks, Reynold. Any closing thoughts or key takeaways?
Well, I think, for the audience, I think maybe three main takeaways. The first is I hope that the audience can really understand that DNS is highly critical, very critical to a smooth running digital presence, and that means your websites, all of the network services that your apps call into, and even your email. So just understanding how important DNS is. The second is that using a managed DNS provider really needs to be part of your solution portfolio. Certainly, at least if you're not going to go all in with a managed DNS provider, then at least augmenting so that you can handle DDoS attacks and you can handle the scale. And then finally, when you're looking at a different managed DNS provider, just focus on availability of the service, performance of the service, and security, so that you can get the best solution to keep your online presence available and performing well.
Excellent. Thanks, Reynold. That's about all the time we have for today's on-demand webcast. My thanks to Reynold Harbin of Neustar for sharing his insights and expertise with us. For more information on this topic, please be sure to click on the links in the resources box on your screen. And thank you for joining us. For Neustar and IDG, I'm Rob O'Regan.